The clink of silverware stopped midair. A laugh died in someone's throat. The sound of the engines, steady and low, was the only heartbeat left inside that plane. It was supposed to be another ordinary flight. Drinks poured. Pillows fluffed. Passengers leaned back into the illusion of comfort. But then, the voice came. It didn't sound like the confident calm of a captain. It shook. It wavered. It broke through the air like thunder. Ladies and gentlemen, if there is any fighter pilot on board, please come to the cockpit immediately. For a moment, no one understood. People blinked, waiting for a punchline. A fighter pilot? On a commercial plane? It sounded absurd, like some bad movie plot. But then the tone of his voice settled in. The fear. The desperation. That's when forks dropped to plates, the clatter sharp and final. A child stopped crying mid-sob, as if even he understood the gravity. And silence fell so thick it suffocated the cabin. Eyes darted. Men in suits, women in dresses, teenagers gripping headphones. Everyone scanning faces. Searching. Waiting for someone to stand up. For a hand to rise. For a hero to reveal themselves. But no one moved. Whispers slid through the rows like snakes. Did he say fighter pilot? What's going on up there? Fear spread quickly, invisible but real, and it rose like smoke, filling the air until it was hard to breathe. And then, in the back of the plane, near the window, she shifted in her sleep. A black woman, head resting against the cold glass, untouched by the panic blooming around her. To most passengers, she wasn't even part of the story. Just another quiet traveler tucked into her seat. She had boarded with no fuss, drawn no attention. The kind of person people glance at once and then forget. Invisible. Ordinary. Forgettable. But now, in the echo of those impossible words, eyes turned toward her. Slowly. Hesitant at first. Then all at once, like a tide crashing toward a single point. A flight attendant froze in the aisle, staring. The wealthy man in first class narrowed his eyes. Even the child who had stopped crying leaned forward, curious. And in that suffocating silence, a strange truth began to take shape. Because while everyone else sat paralyzed, waiting for someone to claim the impossible role, their gazes all landed on the one person they had never considered. The woman who had not stirred. The woman who slept through the fear. The woman who carried no titles, no expensive clothes, no whispers of status. The woman no one had noticed until this moment. The engines hummed louder, almost impatient, as though they too were waiting for an answer. A bead of sweat slid down the temple of the man across the aisle. A mother clutched her baby tighter. Somewhere near the front, someone whispered, "God help us." The captain's voice came again, sharper this time, urgency breaking through the static. "If there is anyone, please, any fighter pilot, time is critical." His voice cracked, the weight of responsibility heavy in every syllable. That was when fear became something more. Not just discomfort. Not just curiosity. But terror. The kind that freezes bones and turns time slow. The passengers held their breath. The champagne flutes no longer sparkled. The rich fabrics of first class no longer mattered. At that moment, money couldn't buy safety, and arrogance couldn't command control. Everyone waited for a miracle. And yet the only movement came from the steady breathing of a black woman asleep in her seat, head against the window, face calm, body still. It was as if the universe had written a script no one expected. The captain begging. The passengers staring. And her, silent, unmoving, untouched by their eyes. A storm was building in the sky outside, invisible but near, and inside the cabin the storm had already arrived. Panic swelled, fear spread, and dignity, quiet, unrecognized dignity, sat in the back row, waiting to wake. What no one knew yet was that the story was never about who they expected to stand up. It was about the one they had overlooked. The one they had dismissed. The one who looked so ordinary they never bothered to wonder who she was, or what she carried within her. They didn't know her story. They didn't know her past. They didn't know the battle she had fought, the skies she had crossed, or the courage buried in her bones. But soon, they would. Because when the world trembles, when the powerful stumble, and when safety is nothing more than a prayer whispered into silence, sometimes the answer doesn't come from the person sitting in first class. Sometimes it comes from the one asleep in the back. The one you never saw coming. And in that cabin, 30,000 feet above the earth, every gaze locked on her, waiting for the storm to wake her. The cabin was no longer a place of quiet travel. It was a hive of whispers, sharp and cutting, rising and falling like restless waves. Fear had no shape, no face, but it lived inside every row, crawling under every seat. Flight attendants rushed down the aisles, their lips pressed tight, their eyes wide with the kind of knowledge passengers weren't supposed to have. They weren't calm anymore. They weren't smiling anymore. Their steps were frantic, their hands trembling as they tried to look composed. And that's when the questions began. "What's happening?" a woman demanded, clutching the armrest of her seat. Her voice cracked like glass. "This is madness," a wealthy man muttered from the front. He wore an expensive watch, polished shoes, the kind of arrogance that usually owned every room he walked into. But his face was pale now, drained of its usual smug glow. He scoffed again, louder this time, so others could hear him. "A fighter pilot? On a commercial flight? What kind of nonsense is this?" His words weren't just disbelief. They were a shield against the fear gnawing at his chest. But the more he spoke, the more others followed. "They must be exaggerating. Something's wrong with the plane, isn't it? No, it has to be terrorism." Every rumor sliced through the air, piling on top of the next until the silence of earlier was replaced with hysteria dressed as conversation. Passengers weren't looking for truth. They were looking for someone to blame. And as the turbulence rattled the plane, oxygen masks swinging like pendulums above their heads, their eyes went searching. Searching for the weak link. The scapegoat. The face that didn't belong. And there she was. Still by the window. Still asleep. The black woman who had drawn no attention at boarding, who now bore the full weight of suspicion without ever opening her eyes. A man leaned across the aisle, whispering harshly to his wife, though loud enough for others to hear. What could she possibly do? Look at her. She doesn't belong here. His words dripped with disdain, but beneath it lay cowardice. He wanted someone else to carry the fear for him. He wanted to turn danger into something he could point at, something small enough to hate. The whispers spread. Some were cruel. Some doubtful. Some filled with a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, she could be more than what she seemed. But most weren't kind. Most carried the weight of prejudice, of quick judgments and small minds. To them, she wasn't a passenger anymore. She was a question mark. A problem. The plane jolted hard, a violent shake that sent drinks spilling and heads snapping back against seats. A scream tore from the back, sharp and raw. The mother clutched her baby tighter, rocking as if her arms could shield both from the falling sky. The attendants gripped the seats to steady themselves, their masks of professionalism gone. Panic was no longer a whisper. It was alive. And then the captain's voice broke through again, desperate now, stripped of all command. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, we are running out of time." The words didn't calm anyone. They tore the last threads of composure apart. Gasps, shouts, prayers. One man pressed his palms together, whispering under his breath in the language of survival. Another pulled out his phone, hands shaking as he tried to call someone he knew he'd never reach. And through it all, the whispers about her only grew louder. Why is she just sitting there? She hasn't even opened her eyes. Maybe she's hiding something. It wasn't just doubt anymore. It was accusation. The arrogance of fear turned their eyes into knives, cutting her down before she'd even spoken a word. She was silent, and her silence became a crime in their eyes. But if they had looked closer, if they had watched more carefully, they would have seen the truth. The way her breathing never faltered. The way her body remained calm even as the plane shook. The way her stillness wasn't ignorance, but control. She wasn't oblivious. She was waiting. And the dignity inside her wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Still, to the others, silence looked like weakness. The wealthy man in the front leaned forward, voice dripping with disdain. "This is what happens when we expect miracles from nobodies. The captain is begging for a fighter pilot, and we're staring at this." He gestured down the aisle, not even bothering to hide who he meant. Laughter followed from another row, bitter and nervous, the kind of laughter that hides trembling hands. But beneath the cruelty, fear still ruled them all. Because no one stood up. No one volunteered. No one had the answer the captain begged for. They wanted her to fail, but they needed her to succeed. They mocked her, but they secretly prayed she was more than she seemed. And yet not one of them dared to believe out loud. The cabin rattled again, the wings groaning against the storm outside. Lightning flashed, spilling white light across their faces, exposing every wrinkle of fear, every bead of sweat. The plane dipped suddenly, violently, and gasps turned into screams. For a moment, it felt like the sky had given up on holding them. And still, she didn't move. Her eyes stayed closed, her head still against the glass. She carried herself like someone untouched by the chaos. Like someone who had lived through worse storms than this one. Like someone who understood that dignity doesn't flinch when the world trembles. They didn't know her story. They didn't know the desert heat she had flown through, the nights when the roar of engines was her only lullaby, the moments when life and death had sat side by side in the cockpit of a fighter jet. They didn't know the weight she carried, or the strength buried inside her bones. To them, she was invisible. Forgettable. Just another passenger. But soon, the storm outside would reveal the storm inside. Soon, silence would turn into revelation. Because while the cabin drowned in doubt, and the captain's voice cracked under the weight of fear, her story was waiting to be told. And when it came, it would silence every whisper in that cabin. The turbulence shook harder now, like the sky itself was warning them. Drinks toppled. A tray clattered to the floor. The lights flickered once, then steadied, but not enough to calm the rising panic. Passengers clung to armrests, jaws tight, prayers spilling under their breath. The captain's last words still hung in the air, heavy, desperate, like smoke you couldn't breathe through. "We are running out of time." And through it all, she stayed still. The woman by the window. The one no one believed in. The one everyone doubted. Her head rested against the glass, eyes closed as if nothing around her mattered. To some, it looked like denial. To others, cowardice. But to those who might have looked closer, it was neither. It was the calm of someone who had lived through chaos before. A flight attendant stopped in the aisle, staring at her, torn between duty and disbelief. Her hands shook as she bent down, gently touching the woman's shoulder. "Ma'am," she whispered, her voice small, almost apologetic. "Ma'am, are you?" The question lingered, fragile, unfinished. The woman stirred. Slowly. Like someone waking not from sleep, but from memory. Her eyes opened, dark and steady, carrying a weight none of them could name. The cabin froze. Passengers leaned forward, breath held, as if the air itself waited for her answer. Her jaw tightened. Her back straightened. She turned, meeting the attendant's eyes with a calm that silenced the row behind her. "Yes." The word was quiet, but it cut through the cabin like steel. "I flew combat missions." Gasps broke out, sharp and quick, as if the air had been punched out of the room. The businessman in the front who had mocked her choked on his own disbelief. "What? Impossible!" He sputtered, shaking his head. "She's lying." But his words carried no power anymore. They fell flat in the silence she had created. She looked ahead, eyes steady, voice low but unshakable. "Iraq. Afghanistan. Call your captain." Every whisper, every insult, every doubt that had filled the cabin moments earlier evaporated in an instant. The flight attendant's face flushed with relief and disbelief all at once. She nodded quickly, almost tripping as she rushed back to the cockpit. And the cabin erupted, not with cheers, not yet, but with chaos of a different kind. Passengers turned to each other, voices overlapping. "Did you hear that? She was a pilot." "No way, no way!" Shock spread like fire, but so did shame. Shame in the eyes of those who had laughed. Shame in the trembling hands of those who had whispered. Shame in the bowed head of the mother who had clutched her child tighter, as if protecting him from the very woman who now stood as their only hope. The billionaire in first class tried to hold his arrogance, but his lips trembled. His face was pale, his confidence gone. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came. He had mocked her, dismissed her, and now, In the space of a few words, she had stripped him of every illusion of control. She rose from her seat. Slowly, gracefully. Each movement carried weight, each step was measured, deliberate, powerful. The aisle became her runway. Passengers pulled their legs in, clearing the path as though the air itself demanded it. Some lowered their eyes, unable to face her. Others stared, wide-eyed, as though watching something wholly unfold before them. She walked with a posture that belonged not to fear, but to command. Her chin lifted. Her shoulders squared. Her silence, once mocked, was now the loudest thing in the cabin. Every step told a story of nights in desert skies, of missions flown under fire, of choices that decided who lived and who didn't. She didn't need to tell them. They could see it in her walk. The turbulence hit again, but she didn't stumble. Where others gripped armrests and gasped, she moved steady, unshaken, as if her body had memorized the rhythm of danger long ago. The aisle was no longer a space between seats. It was her battlefield, and she was moving toward the call only she could answer. The whispers changed. No longer doubt. No longer mockery. Now they carried awe. She's really going. She's one of them. She might save us. The same mouths that had doubted her now spoke of her with reverence. The same eyes that had rolled at her silence now followed her every step with hope. She reached the cockpit door. A flight attendant stood waiting, eyes wide, hands trembling. Without hesitation, the woman nodded once, a signal, a command wrapped in simplicity. The door opened. She stepped inside. And just before it closed, the passengers caught one last glimpse of her. Her face calm. Her eyes sharp. Her jaw set. A fighter pilot. Unrecognized until the moment the world needed her most. The door shut behind her, and silence fell over the cabin again. But it wasn't the silence of fear this time. It was the silence of realization. Of guilt. Of awe. They had doubted her. They had mocked her. They had stripped her dignity without knowing her story. And now, their survival rested in the hands of the woman they had tried to dismiss. The billionaire lowered his head, his watch heavy on his wrist, useless now. His voice, once loud and arrogant, was gone. He could only sit in silence, forced to confront the truth that his money, his arrogance, his status, none of it mattered at 30,000 feet. What mattered was her. And as the passengers waited, every second stretched into eternity, every heartbeat loud in their ears, they carried the weight of their shame and the fragile thread of their hope, all tied to one woman who had walked the aisle with dignity unshaken. The storm outside still raged. The engines groaned. The cabin trembled. But inside, something had already shifted. The overlooked had been revealed. And the whispers that once condemned her had turned into prayers. The cockpit door closed with a heavy click, and for the passengers, it was as if the world itself had sealed them off from their last hope. Time stretched into something unbearable. Seconds crawled. Minutes felt like hours. Every shake of the plane, every groan of the engines made the silence inside the cabin grow heavier. People sat frozen, their faces pale, their hands clutching armrests as if holding on to leather and steel could keep them alive. A woman whispered a prayer under her breath, rocking back and forth, her voice trembling. A teenager gripped his headphones, eyes wide, not hearing the music anymore. The mother with the baby kissed her child's forehead again and again, as though those kisses could build a shield against what might come. And then there was the billionaire. The man who had scoffed, laughed, dismissed. He sat in first class, but the luxury of his seat no longer mattered. His glass of champagne, once a symbol of his control, lay spilled across the carpet, forgotten. He stared at the cockpit door with hollow eyes, the weight of his arrogance pressing down on him like chains. For the first time in his life, money meant nothing. Status meant nothing. His voice, so used to commanding rooms, was silent. Inside that cockpit, she moved with a steadiness the passengers couldn't see but could feel. Her hands found controls as if they were old friends. Her eyes scanned instruments with the calm precision of someone who had been here before. Different plane, different sky, same stakes. The captain's face was pale, drenched in sweat, his hands trembling on the yoke. I don't know if we can, he stammered. But she didn't let him finish. Move, she said firmly, her voice low but unshakable. It wasn't a request. It was command. And he obeyed. Outside, the storm raged. Clouds tore apart the sky. Lightning flashed, lighting up the wings in violent bursts. The wind howled against the fuselage like a living beast trying to tear them apart. But inside, her hands were steady. Her jaw tight. Her eyes narrowed with focus. Every decision came not from fear, but from muscle memory written into her bones long ago. Back in the cabin, the waiting grew unbearable. Some passengers wept openly. Some stared blankly ahead, too numb for tears. Others muttered apologies to no one in particular, confessions whispered to the air in case it was their last chance. The billionaire swallowed hard, his chest heaving. He whispered to himself, "She can't do this, she can't," but deep down, he wasn't doubting her anymore. He was doubting himself. Doubting the life he had lived, believing people like her could never rise above him. The turbulence shook again, violently, throwing a drink cart against the wall with a crash. Screams filled the cabin, but then, suddenly, the plane leveled. Just slightly. Just enough for everyone to notice. The screaming stopped, replaced by silence so sharp it rang in their ears. Then, through the intercom, the captain's voice returned. But it wasn't trembling now. It was calm, firm, controlled. "This is your captain. Thanks to one extraordinary woman, we are safe." The cabin erupted. Applause burst out, thunderous and unstoppable, as if the clapping itself could shake off the fear that had bound them. Some cried with relief, tears streaming down faces once tight with judgment. Some laughed, the sound raw and broken, like survivors of a nightmare waking up. A child shouted, "She saved us!" and his voice cut through the chaos with innocence so pure it pierced every heart. The cockpit door opened, and she stepped out. No smile. No triumph. Just quiet dignity. She walked back down the aisle the same way she had walked forward, measured steps, calm posture, a gravity in her presence that no one could deny now. People moved out of her way, not because they had to, but because respect made them. Heads bowed. Eyes followed. A woman reached out and touched her arm softly, whispering, "Thank you." But she didn't pause. She didn't need their gratitude. She returned to her seat by the window. Sat down. Looked out at the horizon as though nothing had happened. As though she hadn't just carried hundreds of lives through the storm with nothing but skill, courage, and grace. The billionaire rose from his seat slowly, his pride broken, his face flushed with shame. He walked down the aisle, not with the swagger of wealth, but with the trembling steps of a man facing truth. He stopped beside her seat, his voice low, almost cracking. "I'm sorry. I was wrong." She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. No anger. No need to humiliate him. Just calm. Just truth. Her words were simple, but they struck harder than any storm. Dignity doesn't need recognition. It stands on its own. The billionaire lowered his head, unable to speak. And in that silence, the rest of the passengers understood too. They had judged her by her skin. By her silence. By the seat she sat in, far from first class. They had whispered doubts, muttered insults, turned her into less than she was. But when it mattered, when the storm tested every soul on board, it was her dignity, quiet, unseen, underestimated, that had saved them all. As the plane began its descent, the tension in the cabin eased. People exhaled. They smiled through tears. They looked at her differently now, not as a stranger, not as invisible, but as the anchor that had steadied their world. Yet she asked for nothing. Not applause. Not recognition. She looked out the window, her reflection in the glass calm and steady, as if her soul had always known this truth. Greatness doesn't announce itself. It simply acts. The wheels touched the runway at last, the screech of rubber against asphalt loud and final. The cabin shook one last time, but this time no one screamed. They applauded again, but quieter, more reverent, more human. And when the plane finally stopped, they didn't rush to grab bags or push into the aisle. They sat for a moment, still, carrying something heavier than luggage. They carried a lesson. That the people we overlook may be the very ones who save us. That dignity is not in titles, or wealth, or appearances, but in the quiet strength that refuses to bend when the world trembles. That humanity is not measured by what we own, but by how we rise when others fall. And as the passengers stepped off the plane, their lives continued, their stories unfolded, but none of them would ever forget the black woman by the window. The one they had doubted. The one they had mocked. The one who had carried them through the storm. The one who reminded them all that sometimes, the most ordinary face hides the most extraordinary spirit. And that dignity, true dignity, needs no audience.